Hi everyone, we're here at the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum during Oz Armour Fest 2024 and we're taking a look at a vehicle that's on display, which is the 90mm gun motor carriage M36, or the Jackson Tank Destroyer as it's commonly known. Now, this was a vehicle that was employed by the US Army in Europe in the later part of World War II and was designed to counter the threat of the heavier German tanks that were being encountered after the invasion of Normandy. Now, the concept of tank destroyers in the American Army came from discussions that were held in 1941, where American Army High Command studied the outcome of battles in Poland and battles in France and realized that any future war in Europe would be fought in a highly mobile manner by armored formations that were spearheading the attack. And for that reason, what they really needed was a force of vehicles that were mobile and which were heavily armed that could counter those breakthroughs. And this resulted in the development of what became known as Tank Destroyer Branch in the US Army. Now, the idea of Tank Destroyer Branch was not that they would go on the offensive, but they would wait just behind the front lines of the American forces and wait to see if the enemy conducted an armored breakthrough when attacking the American forces. Now, if that breakthrough happened, these tank destroyers were supposed to be deployed at a battalion level and were designed to blunt the breakthrough that might come from German armored vehicles. So they were to be deployed en masse in large numbers, and the idea was to counter any armored breakthrough that might come. So that was the concept behind Tank Destroyer Branch. And with that in mind, they started developing vehicles that could be used by that branch. The first vehicles that were developed were stopgap vehicles. They took an M3 half track and mounted a 75mm M1897A4 gun on it. So it was an open top tank destroyer on a half track. They also had a Dodge light truck, which they mounted a 37mm anti-tank gun on. But they were just stopgap solutions until the first vehicle that could be a dedicated tank destroyer had been developed. Now, the first dedicated tank destroyer that the US developed from the ground up was the M10 gun motor carriage, commonly known as the Wolverine. Now, that mounted a 3-inch gun and was powered by 2 different power plants. It was based on the chassis of the Sherman tank, as this vehicle you see before you is, and borrowed a lot of the driveline and chassis from that Sherman. So you can see here that it's got the 3 bogies per side, each one with a twin wheel. You've got the vertical volute suspension. You have an engine that's mounted in the back, which uses a drive shaft to go forward to a transmission and steering system that's at the front of the vehicle. Now, the M10 Wolverines were built with 2 different engines in them. Some of them had a pair of GM diesel engines. Some of them had the Ford GAA V8 engine. So there was 2 main configurations of M10 Wolverine built. And about 6,400 were made between September 42 and December 43. And it was found to be quite an effective tank destroyer when it was employed in North Africa and Italy. However, as the invasion of Normandy was becoming imminent, the American High Command realized that they needed more firepower, more punch in the tank destroyer units. And so what they conceived was this vehicle here, which became a vehicle that was very similar to the Wolverine in concept, i.e. using a Sherman chassis and an open top turret, but which mounted a 90mm main gun. And so this was the 90mm M3, which was developed from an anti-aircraft gun that had entered production in 1941. So knowing that what they needed was a more heavily armed tank destroyer, they set about the development work to create it. So first thing was to get a version of the 90mm gun into this open top turret, then to design a new turret because the M10 Wolverine turret was too small and only had a manual traverse, and it was definitely felt that the new tank destroyer would need a power traverse to deal with the weight of the new gun, and then to find a way to make sure that it mounted onto the existing chassis that had been developed from the Sherman tank to develop this new tank destroyer. So that work progressed, and it was found that with the new turret, with the new gun, and with the new chassis, they had a fairly formidable combination. And so this entered production in the spring of 1944. So it wasn't available to support the invasion of Normandy, and a lot of M10 Wolverines, the older version of the tank destroyers, were put into the fight at the start of the Battle of Normandy. But straight away, the US forces were encountering these heavier German tanks, and so this vehicle, the upgun version of the tank destroyer, was rushed into service and started to hit the European theatre in September of 1944. Now, this vehicle was far more capable than the M10 Wolverine. It fired an M82 armor-piercing capped round, had a muzzle velocity of about 810 meters per second, and from a firepower point of view was seen as being equivalent roughly to the German Tiger I tank and the gun that was mounted onto the Tiger Is. That was an 8.8 centimeter Kampfwave Canona 36. And so it was a real step up for those tank destroyer units to have access to this gun, which was also the same gun, by the way, that was mounted to the M26 Pershing tank that also appeared later in World War II. So when it went into production, initially these vehicles were built on 300 extra M10 hulls that had been built at the end of M10 production. But then they started to go out and find M10 vehicles that were in training units in America and bring those in to retrofit them with the new turrets. And in the end, some 1,772 M36 Jacksons were built in total up until May 1945, and another 864 were built after that and were used after the war. So it was quite an effective weapon and quite useful in combat. So that's all I want to say about the M36 Jackson tank destroyer. So appreciate you getting to the end of the video and listening to me bang on about this tank destroyer. And I look forward to talking to you soon about another tank or artillery piece or tank destroyer. Until then, stay well and thanks for listening.